Bien, tenemos 70 participantes. Falta un panelista todavía.
Okay, so we have 70 participants. Are we still missing one of the speakers? Yes, Dr. Fernando Valladares. I think we're ready to start.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todos y todas.
So good morning, good day to all of you. Today, the Panamanian Association of Public Health and the movement Ya es Ya here in Panama have been organizing this wonderful conference regarding this problem of climate change. We have 5 extraordinary speakers with the international experience, and they will be sharing this firsthand experience with us. And so we have different angles from the perspectives of each profession. And at this time, in this conference, we will focus on health mainly. So our main participants are health people who work in health providers, but there are also other guests and persons from other professions who will also be participating. So we will have the 5 presentations, main presentations. After that, we will have a Q&A session. And so as the speakers share their presentations, you should write down your questions to then share them through the chat. These questions will be consolidated, trying for it not to be too numerous, but all questions are welcome. And so then the speakers can respond. Any questions that are not able to be answered in this conference, we have the commitment to hand them to the speakers so that they can give us their opinions and answers afterwards, and that we can then share with our distinguished public. So I would now like to contextualize the topic that we will be presenting. So the Panamanian Association of Public Health, together with the Ya es Ya organization, presents this conference about this topic, which undoubtedly is the greatest challenge for humanity. These are very carefully considered words. Our decisions in this decade will literally determine the future of humanity and of the biosphere. 5 international specialists will analyze the climate crisis from the perspective of climate science, ecology, human medicine, history, and justice. The largest scientific review project in the world, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has launched a code red about humanity with a never before seen language from this institution. We are warned that we are running out of time to prevent the catastrophic consequences of an altered climate caused by human activity. The panel of scientists from this conference will analyze the evidence from each one of their specialities and will argue that we are still in time to guarantee a future where we can actually live in our common home, but only if we make it an absolute priority as individuals, as a society, and as a state. So within this context, we will now move on to the very interesting presentations. Our first speaker, Dr. Peter Kalmas, is a scientist from NASA. He's the recipient of the NASA's Early Career Achievement Medal and has over 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications. He started his career in astrophysics with a BSc in physics from Harvard College and a PhD in physics from Columbia University. He led searches for gravitational waves and other astronomical topics. He joined the JPL as a postdoc in the climate physics group. He leads the JPL biodiversity group. Peter is also a known climate activist, author of a book, Being the Change, Live Well and Spark a Climate Revolution. And he is also a habitual collaborator of opinion articles in The Guardian, the LA Times, and many other publications. So we leave you now and in good hands, and welcome, Dr. Kalmas. You have the floor.
Hi, thank you so much. This is a great experiment. It's my first multilingual meeting like this. So it's kind of really interesting. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to keep things to 20 minutes if I can. So let's see. If I share this, I think it'll work. Let me go there, and then let me take this and go to slideshow. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the science in a very general way, and I wanted to include the adjective terrifying in the title because it is science, but I'm human. I'm a father with 2 teenage sons, and I do find this science terrifying. And I think if you're paying attention to it as a human, you have to also have the similar response. So I also want to emphasize that I'm speaking on my own behalf here. Okay, so I wanted to start with a quote from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, which is that investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. So on April 4th of this year, the IPCC report, the Working Group 3 report came out. And one of the overarching points is that if we are serious about stopping the most catastrophic effects of Earth breakdown, and in my opinion, 1.5 degrees Celsius of global heating is going to be pretty bad. I think 1.2 degrees Celsius, which is where we are, is already quite bad. A lot of people are dying around the world, and we're starting to enter global food security crisis. And there's, I think we all have experienced and read the news of a lot of the impacts that are happening around the world. But to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius, to have a fighting chance of doing that, humanity immediately must stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure, and global emissions need to peak now. So now, in sort of the broad, error bars that scientists always have for these things is 2020 to 2025, which we're almost right in the middle of that time period. Okay. So I'm going to give you some basic sort of Earth system indicators about how things are changing on the planet first. Then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my newest research project, which is very centered around basically health, human health issues. I'll talk very briefly about some of the things that keep me up at night, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to be a climate scientist, how I got here. Okay, so this is maybe the most fundamental indicator of change on our planet due to human activity. This is just the global average surface temperature. So thousands and tens of thousands of thermometers that are fed into models, and missing areas are filled in. It's very hard to take the temperature of the whole planet, but we've learned how to do it quite well. You can see over the years, the planet getting hotter and hotter. This should be, on a healthy planet, this would be absolutely flat. The fact that it's increasing every single year on average is one of the things that I find truly terrifying. So whenever I hear, stories on the radio about climate change, or I hear, people talking about issues that are facing humanity. A lot of people write op-eds about how, some of the crises facing humanity, and they don't even, oftentimes don't even mention climate change. But it's this inexorable march towards higher and higher temperatures year after year, pushing against the systems of civilization, that it's what I find truly terrifying. If we got here and then it was just flat, that would be one thing, right? But it just keeps going up and up. And we see this throughout the Earth system. All right, so this is a similar plot, but this is ocean heat. So the heat content in the top 2 kilometers of the ocean, which is absorbing 93% of the excess energy that's coming into the planet. And I can talk about that in just a moment, about why that is the case. And once again, this plot should be completely flat on a healthy planet. So this is maybe, if anything, an even more stable indicator than global surface air temperature, because the oceans have such a high heat capacity that they don't have as much noise in the system, going up and down from year on year as energy sloshes between different parts of the Earth system. And it's fascinating how this measurement is taken. There's a global network of thousands and thousands of floats that are basically independent and that move up and down in the water column on a timescale of about a week, and transmit their data to satellites. So they measure the temperature and other quantities through the water column, the top water column of the ocean. All right, another planetary indicator. So this is atmospheric CO2 fraction. This is going up and up every year as well. And this is the primary driver of the first 2 plots that I showed you. So this is carbon dioxide that's being dumped into our atmosphere every moment of every day because of all of the burning of fossil fuels going on throughout the planet. So all of the engines in cars and all of the engines in airplanes and all of the mining for methane and the heating of homes, everything that we do, every little tiny bit of fossil fuel that we burn for electricity or for heating or for transportation or for industrial processes, it has to go somewhere. And where it goes is just into the atmosphere. And so why this is causing the planet to heat up has to do with quantum mechanics. So these are molecules with 3 atoms on them, 1 carbon and 2 oxygens, that happen to have a vibrational mode which is resonant with infrared photons that are coming up off of our planet and trying to get to space to keep our planet at the same temperature, right? So any black body, any object that has a temperature also emits radiation. And at the temperature of the surface of our Earth and our atmosphere, the primary emission is an infrared radiation. When those photons streaming up into space hit a carbon dioxide molecule, it absorbs that photon, vibrates, and then at some point later it re-emits, but in a random direction. So some of that comes right back down to Earth. So that's why the carbon dioxide acts like a blanket. It's invisible to visible light, right? So the visible light can pass right through the carbon dioxide from the sun. So the same amount of energy comes to the Earth's surface, but it's harder for that energy to get back out into space. So there's an imbalance, and that Earth has to heat up. And as it heats up, it emits more infrared radiation to space. So eventually the same amount will get to space as what's coming in, and the Earth will be back into energy balance, but at a hotter temperature. All right, so you can look at almost any point in the Earth system and you'll see the same thing. You'll see graphs that should be flat, but that have this really, really obvious trend. So you can look at the oceans, and they're getting higher and higher at a particular rate every year, which happens to be accelerating. You can look at the major ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica, and you actually can measure them from space based on their gravitational effect on 2 satellites. And they're getting smaller and smaller every year because on a hotter planet, of course, ice melts. You can look at animals in the ocean and animals on land, and they're moving towards the poles because it's getting too hot for them where they are, and they're moving up mountains at very steady rates. so it's just to me quite remarkable that you can be an ecologist, you can be an oceanologist, you can be an atmospheric scientist, you can be a cryologist studying ice, you can be a hydrologist looking at rivers and aquifers and water on the planet. All of these earth scientists, pretty much no matter where they look, they're seeing this massive signal from global heating, which is again about 80% caused by the burning of fossil fuels. Most of the rest of that is from agriculture and animal agriculture and from deforestation. All of these should be flat, and they're taking us somewhere, right? Since they're not flat, they have this trend. They're taking us somewhere, and that they're taking us to a very terrifying place, because all of these plots that I'm showing you, and there are hundreds more, they're pushing against our civilization. They're pushing against the systems that bring us water and bring us food and, you know, allow our societies to exist. And at some point, when you push against a wall and you push harder every single day, at some point you're going to exceed the limits of what that wall can withstand, and it will have failure. And that failure will probably be catastrophic. It'll be sudden, it'll be unpredictable, it'll be unexpected, and it will be serious. So I think that's what we're looking at. And that's why I'm so basically freaked out that our political leaders are not taking action, and even the public doesn't seem to be aware of how serious this is. Okay, so I'd be remiss talking to an audience in Panama not to talk about climate justice a little bit. So of course, these are the top CO2 emitting countries for cumulative emissions since 1750. And this is not, you know, per capita, this is for the whole country. And you can see my country, the United States, well in the lead. So whenever, oftentimes on Twitter, when I say we need climate action, people tell me I should be talking to China or India. But historically, they still have less emissions than the United States. And this is carbon dioxide emissions per person. So Panama fits in right about there, right kind of next to Brazil and Indonesia. And then another really important factor for climate justice is to understand that the global rich from all countries has an enormous amount of responsibility for this crisis compared to the average person and compared to the poorest people on our planet. So the richest 10% are responsible for about half of all greenhouse gas emissions driving this crisis. And another really important statistic, in my opinion, is that 50% of all aviation emissions from flying in airplanes, which accounts for roughly 3% of all global emissions, which might not sound like much, but it would put it at about the 6th highest emitting country in the world, that 3%. So about half of all aviation emissions is from 1% of humans. That's how privileged the act of flying is. And I know a lot of us here on this call probably fly a lot and feel like we have to fly. What I'm pushing for is a switch towards a climate emergency mode globally. I think we have to stop talking about net zero by 2050. That's way too far in the future. We have to treat this as an emergency right now, because people are dying right now and more suffering is getting locked in every single day. So this is a little bit of an advertisement. If you want, you can, didn't really come through here, but I can maybe put it on my Twitter or something. I've looked at the IPCC reports and kind of divided the impacts decade by decade about like on 2 different scenarios, what's going to happen if we continue emitting fossil fuels like this in the 2030s and the 2040s, and what's going to happen if we switch into a climate emergency mode, because we've still locked in quite a bit of changes to this. And so I'm like, well, I'm curious, you know, I actually did this mainly to help support climate storytellers. So people who wanted to write stories set in the future about, you know, where climate change is actually happening, so that they could be more accurate about what's happening when. Okay, I need to go a little bit faster. So next I want to tell you about a really new research project that I just started, which is about looking at how extreme heat is going to increase in the future over the cities of the world at the neighborhood scale. So very, very high resolution, less than a kilometer. So we're going to go for 375 meter resolution, which will capture the urban heat island effect as well. So yeah, so there are some projections of how bad extreme humid heat is going to be in the future on the planet, but they have limitations. So this is one study that sort of inspired my project by Camilo Mora et al. In 2017. So to understand humid heat, you have to understand that there's two fundamental variables that affect the human body during a heat wave. So you have temperature on this axis. Obviously, the hotter it gets, the more stress on our bodies. And you have humidity on this axis. So we deal with heat, our bodies deal with heat through sweat, of course. And sweat evaporates and takes the energy away from our body, the heat away from our body, and cools it so that we don't overheat. Our bodies produce about 100 watts of power, so constantly producing power just from metabolism, as a lot of you know, since you're doctors. If our bodies aren't able to get, that's about 1/10 of a toaster, about 1/10 of a hairdryer. So it doesn't seem like a lot, but if your body, just like the earth, right, if your body can't get rid of that heat energy, it starts to get hotter and hotter. And eventually you go into heat exhaustion. You might have trouble standing up. You might feel dizzy. You eventually go into heat stroke, and organs of the body can start to shut down catastrophically. Failure of multiple organs, and you can die. So that's why it's so important for our perspiration system to work. And if the atmosphere has too much moisture in it, that sweat can't evaporate, and you can't get rid of that 100 watts of power. So on a kind of worst case climate scenario, this is how many days per year will be beyond this threshold of deadly heat in the decade 2090 to 2100. But this is a very low spatial resolution. I think this is at like even maybe 5 degrees by 5 degrees, which is roughly 500 kilometers. Maybe it's 1 degree. And it also treats all models equally, and it sort of ignores medical thresholds. So this one just looks at lots and lots of, it's actually quite clever, this study. It looks at many, many heat waves. And the ones, the black crosses there are heat waves where at least one person died. This density plot are heat waves where nobody died. And then it does a kind of a curve fit using a machine learning model. And this is the 90% confidence. So it's a very conservative estimate. And these are places, this is the number of days that exceed this very conservative deadly threshold in that decade, 2090 to 2100. All right, so it's a very large team that I'm leading. It's a 3-year project. And I wanted to emphasize that we have health and medical statisticians as part of our team. And we're going to try to relate the high resolution projections of humidity and heat, not just to simple thresholds, but to, to morbidity and mortality thresholds based on health records, which are very hard to get, especially in all of the cities of the world. So we're going to start in California and the US, where we have better health data. And then we're going to try to bootstrap that to other cities of the world. And we will also use some of the standard simple thresholds, such as a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, which is the theoretical maximum that the human body can endure. There's new research that suggests that it's the actual practical threshold is much lower than that. There was a study that came out just a few months ago, I think, where they actually took young, healthy people and put them in rooms with heat and humidity and just monitored them as it got. Sounds kind of brutal, but I'm glad they did that, because they found that even young, healthy people can't withstand wet bulb temperatures beyond 31 degrees Celsius. Then, of course, if you're working outside, it's quite a bit lower. If you're older, or if you're vulnerable, if you have comorbidities, it's quite a bit lower than that. I don't have time to go through exactly how we're going to do these projections. This slide, I just wanted to show you how important it is to get high resolution in these projections. This is what global climate model, this is the spatial resolution typical of global climate models. And this is the resolution that the projections of our study are going to be at, so that we're really going to be able to see whether rich neighborhoods with more trees, how they compare to poor neighborhoods with fewer trees, for example. Okay, I'm going to move on to things that keep me up at night. I think you already kind of got a sense of that through the rest of my talk. Obviously, extreme humid heat. That's why I spent many, many years pursuing the ability to do that study that I just got selected to do a few months ago. Food insecurity. When my first son was born in 2006, we had a party where people came over and we talked about, the future of the kids. And I'm not a lot of fun at parties, but the thing I said for them, I wish for they never experience hunger through starvation, and that they never get basically in a climate war. So I've seen this coming for a very long time, and I don't think it's too late to stop it. But if inaction from world leaders continues, it will happen. So we're heading towards a very bleak world, in my opinion. And we're not doing enough to stop it right now. And that's probably the main thing that keeps me up at night. I just can't understand how, with such clear damage being done to Earth's life support system, why we're not doing more to stop it. So again, United Nations meeting after United Nations meeting, we're heading into the 27th Conference of Parties in November. And all of this talk, the greenhouse gas emissions just keep going up year after year, despite all of these talks. The process has been infiltrated by the fossil fuel industry, to be quite frank. They were the largest delegation at COP26, remarkably. And it raises also the question of what can Panama do if Panama mobilizes? I would hope, Panama is a relatively small nation. I would hope that they could become a real thorn in the side of this United Nations process, joining some of the island nations like the Marshall Islands to really push hard for climate action and to get noisy, to yell at some of the larger countries and to express the terror that I think people who are understanding what's happening are starting to feel, especially young people today. Okay, just 2 more slides. So I did start out from astrophysics. I think I have a kind of perspective of this Earth as a just incredibly beautiful, fragile, precious spaceship, kind of wheeling and turning through this dark, cold void, and giving life to all of us and to all of the other species on this planet. It's just a beautiful, beautiful thing when you if you can zoom out and think about it from a cosmic perspective. So this is an actual photo of our planet taken from a satellite at Saturn that my institution, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, launched. And we're actually down there. I'm down there along with my colleagues, literally waving up at this satellite in space when this picture was taken. And then I'm going to end with one more quote from Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Climate activists are sometimes depicted as dangerous radicals, but the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. So this is why I personally chose to start engaging in civil disobedience. I have to do it. I can't just do my science anymore. I have to get noisy. I have to be a thorn in the side of world leaders. I have to raise the public sense of urgency, since, again, the media is not telling the story correctly. They're not telling it in the correct way, which is that we are literally at risk of losing everything. And I really wish I didn't have to do this. I don't want to wake up early and give talks like this. I don't want to get arrested. I don't want to constantly think about Earth breakdown. I just want to be a dad and do science. But I feel like I have no choice but to do this. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Muy bien. Muchas gracias, Dr. Peter Kalmas.
Very well, thank you
por
very
tan
much, Dr.
extraordinaria
Peter
conferencia.
Kalmas, for
Se los
such
había anunciado.
extraordinary
Tenemos
conference. I'd already told you all we have
de gran trayectoria
high
y lo
caliber
que viene todavía es
speakers,
también muy
and
bueno.
what's
Gracias,
next
doctor
is
Kalmas.
also very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Kalmas.
Seguidamente,
Next,
continuando con el programa, bueno, les recuerdo
moving
que
along with our
deben ir escribiendo sus
agenda,
preguntas
and I remind you that you
para
can
luego
write your
en la
questions so that later
etapa
on
más adelante
during
de preguntas y
the
respuestas
Q&A
a través
stage
del chat poder
via the chat box,
compartirlas y
we'll be
que los
able to share
expositores puedan
the questions and the
resolverlas.
speakers will be able to
Seguidamente
answer them.
tenemos con
Next,
nosotros a el doctor Fernando Valladares. El doctor Valladares es doctor en biología, investigador del Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas y profesor asociado de la Universidad Rey Juan Carlos de Madrid. Es un científico altamente citado con numerosas investigaciones sobre el papel de la biodiversidad y los impactos del cambio climático y de la actividad humana en los ecosistemas. En 2021 recibe el premio Jaume primero en la categoría de protección del medio ambiente y el premio de comunicación ambiental de la Fundación BBVA. Su preocupación por la crisis ambiental le ha empujado a divulgar activamente sobre la crisis ambiental en diversos medios de comunicación y en su canal de la salud de la humanidad en las redes sociales. Doctor Fernando Valladares, bienvenido. Tenemos entonces a nuestra audiencia esperando sus palabras. Queda usted con el micrófono.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Gracias a todos y todas por esta oportunidad de estar aquí hoy compartiendo información y preocupación por el mundo que nos rodea. Hablando de compartir, voy a compartir pantalla para ir ligero a través de las varias cosas que quería contar, que quería compartir hoy, ¿no? De alguna manera el título de la presentación dice ya bastante, ¿no? ¿Qué es lo que pasa? Brevemente, Peter Kalmas ya ha hecho un buen análisis de la parte climática y luego pasar a por qué no hacemos nada o por qué no hacemos nada relevante, ¿no? Esta gráfica del calentamiento global, de una manera u otra, todo el mundo la tenemos ya bastante presente. Vemos ese 1,2 grados de calentamiento sobre la era.
Have that 1.2 degrees of heating in the pre-industrial era, and for many 1.2 degrees seems insignificant, a very small amount, but sometimes we need to look for other ways of expressing this effect of humans on greenhouse gases, this effect on the planet's temperature, and we can illustrate it in terms of energy. When we move on to express it via the amount of energy stored in the glaciers and in all the components of the climate system, the amount of energy is equivalent to 600,000 atomic bombs like the Hiroshima bomb. This can give us a more accurate, more real, more intuitive idea of what we've done with climate. But there's also other indicators of these human interventions in the global systems, particularly the atmosphere. A recent article showed that we've shrunk the stratosphere. After 1980, more or less, we've reduced almost half a kilometer the width of the stratosphere because of some effects from greenhouse gas effects that we put onto the troposphere, the layer right below it. And we hope to see, or not hope, we expect to see further reduction of this stratosphere. And this has consequences. The correct functioning of everything that happens in this layer in the stratosphere, it affects satellites, it affects orbital lifespan, recovery of satellites, even GPS satellite navigation is affected by it, and some radio communication means that use this layer to reflect back the waves. So this is considered to be an independent indicator of climate change. It is estimated that it is a short appearance in about 15 years, and it gives us an idea of the global magnitude of the greenhouse gas emissions produced by humans. Now, we're suffering the consequences of accumulating all this energy over the past 50 years in the different components of the climate system. And Perhaps a first reflection I can share is that in climate, nothing is isolated, especially intense climate events, those that catch our attention, those that make the headlines. They're part of a category that in science we call composed events. These composed events are illustrated with, for example, the tremendous heat wave back in 2010 in Russia that produced great affections in crops, and they restricted countries' exports of wheat. And these exports of wheat, this affection contributed to social inequality and disruptions in Egypt. And this also intensified fires. There was high contamination and affected the Cisco, and that added hundreds of deceased on top of the deceased for the heat wave. Pakistan and other neighboring other countries were also affected, and this is the one of the best studied composed climatic events because of the whole social aspects, climatic aspects, economic aspects that were the result of such an extreme event. To share some more numbers where we are in terms of climate change, let's keep in mind that half of the migration movements of humans are produced by climate change. And it is estimated that climate change by 2050 could be affecting around 216 million people moving away from their homes, being displaced. This is 5 times as many displaced people produced by the Second World War, just to put these human dramas in context. Climate change also affects human health in various ways. Not only severe extreme climates have direct impacts on health, but perhaps what catches our attention the most is that there's a whole constellation of alterations in the air that produce allergies, respiratory issues, vectors for infectious diseases are distributed outside of their natural areas of occurrence, and therefore, along with them, with mosquitoes and fleas, they carry with them dangerous infectious diseases, not only malaria, but also Lyme disease, chikungunya, West Nile virus, and many other dangerous viruses. Now, we also need to look into all the impacts on the quality and amount of water and the food supply. That is why, as we were saying earlier, this is why millions of people are forced to move. It's very difficult to estimate how many people die as a result of climate change. Direct deaths could be about 500,000 every year, but it is estimated that we add direct and indirect deaths, we could be talking about tens of millions of people dying every year due to climate change. And again, to put this in context, this is equivalent to having climate change causing every 10 years, every decade, the same amount of deaths caused by the whole of the Second World War. Climate change affects ecosystems in various ways. It threatens the foundation itself of ecosystems, the basis or the soil, its properties and biodiversity, but it also affects the components of ecosystems. It affects species, the species that make up these ecosystems and that allow them to each fulfill their ecological functions and many of the goods and services that humanity needs. But it also happens on the opposite direction. Degraded soil and the loss of biodiversity accelerate climate change, or in any event, they cannot serve as buffers, and this does not help to adapt to this global warming and all the effects of climate change. This is very well illustrated with something that has become widely known, that the London group studied years ago, which has been simplified or rather summarized in what is known as inflection points. There's about 15 tipping points, and these climate tipping points, there's 9 of them that are considered to be activated already, that are considered to be a concern for the population and for ecosystems, and they cover the whole planet from coral reefs in Australia and New Zealand to the Amazon forest, changes in boreal forest. And I believe one of the most concerning one is permafrost soils that are permanently frozen, happening especially in Siberia, the north of Asia and Europe and Canada. In these zones, the soil has traditionally been frozen throughout all or most of the year, and in being frozen, it traps greenhouse gases. They're stuck in this ice, and among these gases we have CO2 and methane. And what happens with warming is that these frozen soils melt away and they release these greenhouse gases, and upon the release they increase the warming, and this in turn, as a consequence, leads to a greater warming, producing a higher release of greenhouse gases, and so on and so forth in an uncontrolled cycle. There's no feedback for a regulation. But on top of this, it also happens with permafrost and all bodies of snow and ice, which where they are clearer than the surface where they are. So when they melt away, when ice melts and the snow melts, what comes up is rocks, vegetation, dirt, or water, which are darker in color than that snow or ice. Therefore, they absorb more radiation. So in producing more heat, they replace white surfaces for darker surfaces. More radiation is absorbed, more radiation, more heat, more fusion, and then we have another feedback cycle, positive feedback cycle, that is not easily regulated and which amplifies the speed at which the planet warms. Another one of the tipping points, another complex phenomenon, is the thermohaline circulation. This occurs in the seas and oceans of the world in such a way that the temperature, apart from nutrients and salt and some other components of the marine ecosystem, they're exchanged between the tropical and equatorial zones with the more temperate zones. The more northern hemisphere, for example, it's widely known, this effect of transporting heat from the tropical zones and the equator towards the north of Europe or the north of America. Without that transmission of heat, that heat transfer, those regions would be going to a thermal disconnect, despite the fact that the rest of the planet is warming. We already have empirical evidence. A few decades ago, there were just calculations. Some Hollywood movies were inspired in these models, but now we can say that there's already numerical data that are measuring the speed of this heat transfer loop that is slowing down. And there are short circuits with the fusion of the big glaciers of Greenland, which in the case of the Northern Atlantic, they're preventing heat to reach these higher latitudes. And there's a series of scale down effects that are quite complex. For example, the Amazon forest needs the fertility of the desert. The Amazon is one of the big lungs of the planet. The water cycle, the CO2 cycles, the energy matter cycles are greatly affected by whatever happens to the Amazon forest. And this forest needs fertility, which is a fertility that comes with the sand and dust storms that periodically go over the Atlantic from the Sahara to the Amazon. A recent study of Giovanni and associates show that the Saharan dust is reducing in its frequency, and less of these dust contributions are occurring throughout the Atlantic. In fact, it's estimated that in 3 decades, barely 1/3 of the amount of these fertilizing Saharan dust will move towards the Amazon. So if there were problems with deforestation, with fires, with different threats, including climate change itself that poses a risk on the Amazon, we now have this deficiency in contributions for fertilizers coming from the Sahara, which will become less and less. So climate change doesn't occur on its own. There's strong environmental degradation of many things happening at the same time. There's various ways of contamination, loss of biodiversity, and climate change itself all at once. And an important aspect is what happens with water. Water is a precious good, and the cycle of water is affected by climate change, but humanity depends on water greatly. And 1 out of 3 people in the world doesn't have enough water. So in some countries, we waste away water. We're not even aware that some genes, a pair of genes require or are equivalent to 11,000 liters of water. And then in many parts of the planet, people don't have enough water for basic needs. And to make this even more complicated, we have a social attitude, a certain permissiveness to steal away water. We're stealing water from one place to the other. There are three more or less official ways of stealing water. One is overexploitation of underground water. And for doing it at the level we're doing it globally, we're extracting so much water from the underground layers at such speed that we've changed the gravity center, center of gravity of the planet, and the angle of inclination has somewhat changed. Just to give you an idea, another way of stealing water, and I say stealing water because undoubtedly if we exploit water in one place from the underground, it will produce not having enough water a couple kilometers down the stream. So another way of stealing water is moving water from one basin to the next. Humans decide that one region needs more water than another region, so they transport water from one river to the other, and we generate very severe environmental problems. In Spain, we have many cases. In many other arid areas of the planet, we've done it. 50 years ago, they were considered admirable engineering works. Now they're considered attacks on the environment. And here we have Colorado River that was used to supply California with water, taking away water from other places. And the third way is to produce clouds with these silver particles that create condensation nuclei for clouds. And again, it's stealing water because the water, precipitation, it's water that will no longer fall a couple kilometers down the road. And in fact, we are going through water wars. If we Google it, the first thing you'll get is the courageous protests of the Cochabamba, Bolivia people. They fought against a privatization effort for water, potable water, because many of them and us think water is public. So the people of Cochabamba managed to stop this effort, but water is undoubtedly part of the stock in different parts of the planet as a pilot, but it's still a threat that's global on a basic need good. Up until now, it's estimated that water, or conflicts involving water, have caused 343 important wars in the world. And climate change will unfortunately accentuate all this. After more than 30 years, if we think of the Rio de Janeiro summit of 1992, we really haven't done much. Greenhouse gases continue to increase, although we keep on saying that we need to control them. They keep on increasing. Now, why do we do all this? Why not take measures when science has been saying this? It seems like society has started to understand, even politicians, it would seem that they're signing some agreements and conventions, but we end up really doing nothing efficacious. There's a word that could perhaps summarize partly the reason why we're not doing anything, or it's a term that we could coin as organized hypocrisy. It's a way of getting all in agreement to not see the truth, not say things as they are, or to disguise facts and to make it seem as if everyone was doing fine when it isn't the case. I'll give you some examples. In Europe is not as green as it says it is. And it seems that we had to go through the cruel invasion of Ukraine by Russia for us to realize that Europe really depended on Russia's oil and gas. So this has truly affected the energy system in Europe. Germany is trying to adapt, and now there are tremendous threats on Denmark and the Netherlands because they're not willing to trade with Russia. Russia will cut them out of the oil supply. And fortunately, it's not as cold as back in April when Russia invaded Ukraine, but it is nevertheless a great impact. And we really don't know how this will all end up being. It is a manifestation of our dependence on fossil fuels in Europe. In the midst of a moment when Europe is saying that it's green, we're heading towards a Green Deal, a new way of using natural resources, among them fossil fuels, which, as you all know, most should remain where they are underground. Another example of organized hypocrisy is that we have for decades been saying that using carbon to generate energy is not advisable because it produces little energy for the amount of contamination that it produces and because of the environmental footprint and greenhouse gases. So many countries, Spain and everywhere in the world, there's been strategies and policies where there are dismounting thermal energy stations that burn coal. Very well. However, a recent report of the International Energy Agency states that never in the history of humanity has there been so much coal used to produce energy. So this is yet another example of organized hypocrisy. Or there are countries as Sweden, there are other countries, but this could illustrate this organized hypocrisy because it's a country where the average person has great knowledge of the environmental crisis, and despite having signed the Paris Agreement for the reduction of emissions, Bose and Holtman reveal that Sweden, as a progressive country in climate, it doesn't have the adequate law, a law that's adequate for their level, for their country, to face the country agreement. In other words, Sweden itself doesn't have the legal framework internally that's needed in order to fulfill what they have promised that they would say. Nobody forced Sweden to sign. Sweden, as well as many other countries, signed 7 years ago the Paris Agreement for emissions reduction, and they cannot do it because of a legal, or they're not willing to do it because of a legal reason. Although in their hypocrisy, they may pretend that they will do it. Another more concerning example, because of its international reach, is banking hypocrisy. Banks, financial entities, they're some of the main instruments for the destruction of the environment. In fact, they devote a great amount, astronomical amounts of money to fund projects that are very carbon intensive, very destructive for biodiversity. At the Glasgow summit last year, COP26, we saw with certain optimism, with certain hopefulness, and we were somewhat ingenious. We thought that the main 30 banks and financial entities of the world had partnered up in a network, in a partnership, and it seemed that they were going to do what was needed. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. It took place, as I said, within the framework of the Glasgow Summit, COP26, and these 30 banks, they have names and last names, Banque Nationale de Paris and all the others that we can know. They partnered up here, but in reality, none of them have the least plan in details to make that reduction for the end of the decade to reduce greenhouse gas effects. None of them, only 10 out of the 30 or 11 out of the 30 banks or financial institutions have very small initiatives. Of course, they have produced an enormous, beautiful report with beautiful photographs, and it's a completely hollow document. What we have found is that the 30 financial entities are blocking negotiations internally within the countries or within the European Union to advance in the decarbonization of the economy. So not only are they not doing what they said they would do to partner up in order to to help reach net zero, but they're actively working for that net zero to not occur or to take longer to occur. I'd like to wrap up with some snapshots describing that it is possible to mitigate climate change. Apart from being possible, it's quite healthy for the human species. Hamilton and associates in the Lancet, they estimated the people who would not die. We started by talking about those who die, the tens of millions of people dying as a result of climate change. But I'd like to end by talking about the people who would not die if we apply the measures from the Paris Agreement. Let's keep in mind that we have all signed the Paris Agreement. It's a commitment acquired 7 years ago, and we really have done very little. But it's signed. But if we fulfilled Paris from now until 18 years down the road in 2040, we'd have 6 million people saved because of changing diet, 2 million people who would break away from lack of mobility, and 1.6 million saved because of reduction of atmospheric contamination. we can at least certify and estimate that about 10 million people would not die if we fulfill the Paris Agreement. So it is quite healthy, really. And there's more good news. For example, energy needs of people, of humanity, society. We really need very little energy to live. A recent study by Jackson and Associates shows that when they estimated 9 human health and well-being indicators, these 9 indicators were reached with an amount of energy per capita that was quite small. In the graphs in each of the maps on the lower left corner, we can see the increase of well-being as we increase the availability of energy, but it reaches a moment when it's saturated, and no matter how much energy we have, we are no more healthier or happier for it. And this is estimated at a value of 75 gigajoules. But this amount of energy, which is enough to reach all the well-being and health indicators, it is half of what is being consumed per capita in Spain, 1/3 of what is consumed in average in Europe, or 1/5 of what is consumed by a citizen in North America. So the good news of this is that we really don't need more energy. We don't need a massive infrastructure of energy infrastructures as it would seem, but really we have to distribute energy. We need to make a more efficient distribution of energy, because in many countries, they have a surplus, countries on light colors, yellow and orange, and in some other countries, it's lacking, countries in Africa, South America, or Asia. And I say that it's feasible because economically it is feasible. It would seem that the economy determines what we can and cannot do. And in the external report, we were talking about the fact that an option is not to do anything, but when they estimated economically what it means to not do anything, they realized that humanity has no money.
So when they calculated what it meant to not do anything, they realized that climate change is actually very expensive. So there's a lot of work, there's a lot of studies. I'm just giving you a small snapshot, but there's a lot of studies that show that investing in nature and conserving the surface. So here we see the profitability of conserving the soil, looking at 15% of the soil. If we were able to conserve 30% of the surface of the earth, this is of course an investment. These are the blue bars in the graphs, the different scenarios that calculate on this study. So the blue bars are millions of dollars that would cost every year, but the yellow and orange indicate the incomes and the benefits of these nature conservation, and the gray bars show the multiplier effect of tourism. So it is healthy, it is possible, we have the technology, and financially the numbers work. So really the question is, if we know what we need to do, and the scientists have been telling us for a while, the question is, will we do it? Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Fernando
Thank you
Valladares.
very much, Dr.
Interesantísima su
Fernando
presentación.
Valladares.
Muchas
Very
gracias.
interesting
Y
presentation.
distinguida audiencia,
Thank you very much.
provecho
And dear
todo lo que
distinguished
estamos recibiendo.
audience, I hope you're
Seguidamente,
really enjoying and taking advantage of
la
all of this that
participación
we are receiving.
de
So
Amy
next we have the
Woodson-Bolton.
participation of Amy
Amy
Woodson.
Woodson-Bolton es profesora
Amy
y
Woodson
expresidenta del
Bolton
Departamento
is
de Historia de la Universidad
professor
Loyola Marymount de Los Ángeles,
and
California.
past chair of the Department of History at
Es
Loyola
historiadora de
Marymount
Gran
University
Bretaña
in LA,
e
California.
Irlanda.
She's a historian of
Trabaja
Britain and
sobre las
Ireland. She
reacciones
works
culturales a
on
la
cultural
industrialización,
reactions to
incluyendo
industrialization,
la historia de los museos
including the history
y
of
las ideas
museums
sobre
and
el arte
ideas
primitivo
about
en la
primitive art
antropología
in
y la historia del
anthropology
arte.
and art history.
Imparte cursos británicos,
She
europeos y
teaches
mundiales
modern British,
modernos
European, and
centrados
global
en la historia
courses
imperial,
that
cultural,
focus on
pública
imperial,
y
culture,
medioambiental.
public, and environmental history.
Bienvenida, profesora Amy Woodson-Bolton.
Welcome, Professor Amy
Queda el
Woodson-Bolton.
micrófono con usted.
You have the floor.
Thank you so much. So when I was invited, and I'm so thrilled to be here, I'm so thrilled to be speaking with all of you. I kind of laughed at the idea of giving a history of the world in 15 minutes and the kind of history of our fossil fuel dependence, but I'm going to try. And I have to say, I'm so grateful as a historian to be included in this conversation. Also somebody who's been active in environmental issues and climate issues for a very, very long time. I do teach global environmental history, and I think it's something that especially our students are very concerned about. And so it's a wonderful thing to teach, because I think this kind of historical perspective is really, really valuable. So I want to pick up on a couple of things that we've already heard about. How did we get here? Why aren't we doing more? I love the phrase organized hypocrisy. And I think when we take a historical perspective, we can understand maybe definitely how we got here, maybe also why we aren't doing more. I also want to pick up something that Dr. Kalmas said about tipping points or pushing against a wall, and this idea of kind of catastrophic events with unexpected consequences, because that's something that historians study all the time and something we're really interested in. Today, I'm going to talk through several important turning points to fossil fuel dependence. And then I want to talk just very, very quickly about, in particular in the 20th century, the public relations and corporate disinformation that have contributed to our continuing inaction. So when I'm talking about turning points to fossil fuel dependence, one way of thinking about it is that there was growing efficiency in how we could exploit natural resources. But it's not just growing efficiency, it's also the power imbalances that this whole system, this global system created, that led to and contributed to that ever increasing exploitation of resources. And resources that were both natural resources, but also human resources, human labor and human populations. Today, I want to talk about 3 turning points: European colonization of the Americas, industrialization, and World War II. There are ways of telling this story, and that has happened for a very long time, that really emphasized European superiority, and that often emphasized even racial superiority. That was part of the project of colonization and imperialism. And it's part of often the way we've heard this story told. As somebody who concentrates on British history, a lot of British history is, look how clever the British were for inventing the steam engine. Look how great their technology was. What I want to suggest to you is that actually, to really understand why we're not doing more, why fossil fuels are so embedded in our culture, in our societies, in our politics, in the way we even tell these stories and what we talk about, we have to go back much further. So I want to start with the European colonization of the Americas. As I'm sure you're aware, one of the things that Europeans brought with them when they stumbled on to the Western Hemisphere was smallpox and a host of diseases that really created this extraordinary genocide and depopulation of the peoples of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. One of the things that more recently historians and scientists are understanding is that that depopulation led to profound reforestation as agricultural land moved back into forests. There were a couple consequences of this gradual reforestation and depopulation. The depopulation led Europeans, instead of enslaving the indigenous peoples, to start importing Africans as labor, creating the transatlantic slave trade. The other thing that happened was, from the reforestation, was the great pulling out of carbon dioxide, the kind of opposite effect to what we're seeing now, that contributed to a global little ice age. And I think it's a great example of what we're starting to understand in terms of climate history as well, not just of the increasing CO2, but here decreasing CO2 that contributed to the little ice age. And there are a number of different measures that scientists have used to estimate the way that that reforestation contributed to the little ice age. The other thing that I just mentioned, the transatlantic slave trade, I'm sure you're all very well of, that went in a very different direction. That was a tremendous and profound genocide and exploitation and brutal use of people as commodities, but it also, or I should say, and it also contributed to an entirely new economic system developing in the Atlantic world based on cash crop plantations, mining, deforestation, and manufacturing. And this system generated new wealth, generated demands for products from Britain, especially. And, you know, even though we don't often connect the factories of Manchester, let's say, to the cotton plantations, all of those factories were using, for example, the cotton grown by enslaved laborers. The kind of historians are working, and this is from a really wonderful resource, slavevoyages.org. You know, so historians are working to reconstruct who benefited from the slave trade, the numbers of people, the millions and millions of people brought over from Africa, treated like commodities, brought over to the Americas. And it's worth pointing out that in some of these plantations, places like Brazil, on the sugar plantations, life expectancy was about 7 years. So this was an incredibly brutal system that lasted for hundreds of years and created an entirely new economy. All right, so what does this have to do with fossil fuels? As deforestation opened up, as this new system of exploitation and profit seeking opened up across the Atlantic world, there are a couple of different ways historians look at this. One is that colonies allowed places like England to cut down their own forests and turn to new sources of energy. One of those sources of energy was pit coal. People had already used charcoal for a long time. Now they turned to digging coal out of the ground. And as you may know, Britain in particular is very, very rich in coal. China, we could maybe notice, had actually already shifted to coal hundreds of years before, but by around 1700, people in Britain and gradually across Europe were shifting to coal. They also were looking for more ways to make energy out of that coal, to use that energy, and gradually improving steam engines. So the whole system of what we think of as industrial revolution, many historians now suggest we should think of as industrial evolution, and think of it as deeply connected to the Atlantic system based on racialized slavery. As industrialization went on, and this is an image of actually German guns being exhibited in Chicago in 1893, a whole new system of competition got set up. And so again, when we think about how did we get here and why are we not doing more, the power of the modern world depended on this turning point, on industrialization, on the railroads, the steam engines, the weapons, but also the nationalism and imperialism that those machines made possible. When we think about the enormous power that these weapons now gave, whether it was machine guns, whether it was steam engines, but also a new reason for exploitation. So again, thinking about that feedback loop where you have the power to exploit resources and then a motivation to exploit them, and the more power you have, the more you can exploit them, led to European countries in particular taking over huge parts of the world. The gradual expansion of Europeans into all parts of the globe, taking over huge territories, what we call the scramble for Africa, gradually colonizing the entire African, virtually the entire African continent, and moving on into different parts of the world. India, parts of China, competing with China, Indonesia, and in turn provoking places like Germany, which had not industrialized at the same time as Britain, and Japan to undergo rapid industrialization so as to keep up with this kind of global competition. The next turning point, or I should say the final turning point I want to talk about, is World War II. While a lot of these changes had begun in World War I, the years around World War II and this global conflict in particular pushed a number of shifts that now, as we gain historical perspective on it, we can really see the way it mobilized global supply chains, led to increasing battles over oil fields and control of oil, especially as nations shifted from coal to petroleum. the increased use of synthetics, plastics in particular, jet engines, and then the global geopolitical system that emerged after World War II, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. And here, this is probably a quite familiar map, but to kind of think about, again, World War II as a really global conflict, bringing across and bringing people and supply chains. So, for instance, the aluminum that made it possible for Britain to fight the Germans in the air through the Battle of Britain, through the aerial bombardment campaigns. Much of that aluminum came from British Guyana that was shipped up to Canada and processed in new hydropower plants, for instance, in Canada. This was a global campaign, and the kinds of technological innovations, plastics, jet engines, many electronic appliances, those sorts of innovations led to a really different world. It also led to the new system of the Soviet Union and the United States facing off against each other in the post-war years. And that kind of competition really determined the way that the newly independent nations achieved their own national independence. So what did that model look like? Well, for many countries, they wanted to emulate what the United States increasingly wanted to achieve: suburbs, plastics, home electronics, growth, and an abundance of cheap oil. The United States had its own supply of oil and was therefore, as the way we think of it, energy independent up until the 1970s. But this model of growth and this idea of a kind of endless supply of land, for suburbs, of automobiles, of manufacturing, of building an economy on endless growth, dependent on a consumer-driven economy, this vision became the model for many places around the world that wanted to compete with the United States, that wanted to achieve this kind of lifestyle. And it proved, of course, completely unsustainable. So in the 20th century, reacting to many of these changes, people started raising the alarm that actually, as much as this idea of the American dream seemed beautiful and wonderful, and that maybe everyone could be lifted out of poverty to achieve their own beautiful home in the suburbs, people started to sound the alarm that actually it depended on very toxic chemicals, on air pollution that was starting to threaten millions of people, that on water pollution, on a completely unsustainable and toxic way of life. And as public fears spread about litter, about chemicals, about pollution, and increasingly about global warming, corporations used disinformation to prevent regulation. And they also turned to public relations. So for instance, and I'm just going to give two examples here. In the 1970s, a new campaign called the Keep America Beautiful campaign urged people to fight litter. So even though they were selling all kinds of things that couldn't be recycled, where there was no plan for all of these new disposable things that manufacturers were selling, they said, no, it's the individual consumer that has to do something about this. They used the image of what they called the crying Indian. He was not, in fact, Native American. He was an Italian American called Iron Eyes Cody. In this image, they say, in the fight against litter and pollution, we still have so far to go. They made people feel bad individually for their choices, for what they were doing, when in fact, of course, they wanted to just sell more. So if it becomes the consumer's problem, it's not their problem. And it's not the role of governments to regulate, right, any of this pollution. In a very similar way, we've seen the move to a carbon footprint, right? If you might have heard of that phrase, a carbon footprint. How much carbon are you individually as a consumer producing? What choices are you making? The question I think we should be asking is why, again, is it the consumer's problem? Why is this not an issue when everything we've been hearing is this needs systemic change, right? These are big systemic questions. Another thing that happened is, and we're learning more and more about this, is actually disinformation. So funding research, fossil fuel companies funding research, putting research out there in the world that questioned the science of global warming. This is an example, shockingly, from 2019, which again, this is settled science. We've been hearing from our experts today. This is not up for debate. And yet, the way that the fossil fuel companies have been able to say, is it true? Is it real? Muddy the waters, confuse all of us. So again, one of the things I just want to emphasize is when we look at the longer history, it should not be surprising to us that those in power are going to fight this tooth and nail, because this is how nation states, how corporations have really become as powerful as they are. These are entrenched political, economic interests, and they have tied, particularly in the 20th century, but also going back to the 19th century, and even in some ways even earlier, they have tied individual well-being with a vision of the world based on perpetual growth, on perpetual exploitation of resources, and on a system where governments actually ensure that that can continue, and that that kind of relationship where the military and industry, and you may know the phrase, the military industrial complex, the military and industry are intimately linked. And that has been true now for hundreds of years. So the question I think for all of us is, how do we envision something really different? Because again, the roots go back hundreds of years. What I always tell my students, that what I want to leave you with today is, people made these systems. They're not inevitable, they're not natural, they didn't happen by some, fiat or strange system. These were people who made these systems, and people can unmake them too, if we just have the courage really to look at it in the face and to stand up against it. Thank you so much for your time.
Muchísimas gracias, profesora Amy Woodson Bolton.
Thank you so much, Professor Amy Woodson Bolton. Extraordinary presentation. We're very grateful in Panama for this information.
Bueno, seguidamente vamos a tener la
we will now
participación
have the
de la ingeniera
participation of
Daniela García Aguirre.
Ms. Daniela García
La ingeniera García Aguirre es ingeniera ambiental y abogada
García
de la
Aguirre. She's
Universidad
an
de los
environmental
Andes,
engineer and lawyer from the
con
University
maestría en
of the
políticas
Andes with a
públicas y
master's
derecho
in public
ambiental de la
policy and
Universidad de Stanford.
environmental law from Stanford
Actualmente
University.
trabajando en
She's
la
currently
iniciativa
working
por el aire
in
limpio
the Clean Air
de la
Initiative
Asociación Interamericana por la
of the
Defensa del
Inter-American
Ambiente, AIDA.
Association for Environmental
Con ustedes
Defense,
entonces,
AIDA.
la ingeniera Daniela García,
And with
bienvenida.
you, Engineer Daniela García Aguirre, welcome. Thank you so much, Carlos, and I will start then to share my screen, and let me know when you can see it.
Listo, ya está.
Okay, it's there. Thank you so much. And so thank you so much to the speakers before me. I think you are putting some points on the table that are very important to understand this issue and the urgency of taking action, and taking action now. The topic I want to bring up is perhaps makes this topic quite complex and expanding the perspective to other points of view. And so what I want to do is to talk a little bit about why talking about the quality of the air also when we're talking about the climate. So before starting, I want to introduce you to the organization I represent. It's AIDA. It's a group of scientists and lawyers that use law to protect the environment, mainly in Latin America. And we do it taking on projects that help to strengthen and to enforce laws, policies, and environmental regulations. So our work is regarded to protecting the environment and the biodiversity and the humans who depend on these resources, mainly in Latin America. So why talk about air pollution when we're talking about climate? And so what's important to mention here is that air pollution is a determinant of health and of the life quality of life. So what this means is that it's part of an ensemble of factors at the personal and social, economic, and environmental factors that is identify or determine the health of individuals or populations as an ensemble. And basically, air quality or poor air quality is the main environmental cause of death on the planet. And the data that support this statement are truly alarming. The World Health Organization calculates that more than 13 million deaths per year globally are due to environmental causes that could be prevented. And these 13 million deaths, we're talking about more than 8 million are caused by poor air quality or atmospheric pollution. In these deaths, we include 600,000 girls and boys. So we see that poor air quality kills more people even than tobacco smoke. And so 90% of the global population lives in highly polluted areas. So they are inhaling every day a contaminated air that is putting their life and health and well-being at risk. So to place a little bit in the international context, excuse me that there are here some names that are too small to see, but what we want to show here is that there is a relationship between GDP and atmospheric pollution. And clearly Latin American countries, where moreover 80% of Latin American population lives in the urban areas, we see that the concentration of PM10 are way above what is recommended by the WHO. This is the case of Mexico, Chile, El Salvador, Peru, Honduras. Whereas in countries with greater income, the pollution by particle is much lower. However, most cities, or these cities with greater incomes, have problems with other contaminants such as nitrogen dioxide. And so the air in 17% of the countries that have high level GDP is below the guidelines as established by WHO. So, but in countries with lower income, the air quality in less than 1% of only in less than 1% of studies is able to meet the recommended thresholds. So you can see that globally, that low and medium income countries have greater exposure to unhealthy exposure to particles. And this is where most people in Latin America live. So basically, we have an industrial park of housings and mobile and fixed sources that generate the emissions, and there's transport of these particles, which then becomes an emission, which is the concentration of the particles in the environment. And this is what then leads to exposure, which is an inhaled fraction. So we as inhabitants of the cities, which is what we are breathing from these emissions. And to understand a little bit this whole process that we're so concerned about, we could divide a few contaminants into these three main groups. So short lifespan climate pollutants, criteria contaminants, and greenhouse effect. So criteria contaminants are the ones that are come most to our attention when we talk about air quality, because these are the ones that are regulated, for which there has been established a maximum allowed concentration in environmental air with the objective of protecting human health. Particles, particularly PM2.5 that you can see here, have become very relevant in the context of our cities because they are capable of deeply penetrating the lungs and even entering the blood flow, causing various impacts on our health. So to give you an idea, these are some of the contaminants that usually draw our attention when we're talking about air quality in cities. And why? Because they're associated with many diseases. So we already talked about millions of persons who die every year because of atmospheric pollution. Hundreds of millions of people suffer diseases because of poor air quality. We know exposure to these types of contaminants has an impact on our health in many ways. Some of them due to respiratory infections, different types of cancer, cardiac diseases, cerebrovascular events, in other cases, obstetric problems. And there's more and more evidence that relate atmospheric pollution with many health problems. So what has been the main problem? Well, dependence on fossil fuels. The burning of these fuels, which today we know that the cause of the atmospheric emissions generates more premature deaths than even HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis altogether. Another very important factor is that there are groups that are sensitive to poor air quality. For example, girls and boys are particularly vulnerable to the poor effects, the negative effects of poor air quality, because their physiological factors mean that they have a much higher rate of breathing than adults, and therefore the higher dose of contamination. We know that atmospheric contamination pollution also disproportionately affects women and poorer communities, and also being in conditions of cooking over wood fire makes it worse, which are usually communities, low resource communities, that are also breathing greater contaminants in their own homes. So in this group of sensitive community persons and pregnant women. So all of this is here to clarify, or to share with you rather, that atmospheric pollution is an issue of human rights. It's an issue of international commitments, because here we have a number of rights that are affected when we're exposed to pollution. Of course, life, health, water, and housing, and of course, a right to a healthy environment. But then why talk about climate and air together? So presentations prior to mine make it very clear that climate change, or the climate crisis, is the main challenge that humanity must face globally. It's the largest challenge that we are facing right now. It is a crisis that is unprecedented, and we are facing a number of events related to climate change. And we see that also locally, in most of the main cities in the world, especially in Latin America, or mostly evident in Latin America, air pollution is a very serious problem that affects persons' health. In both cases, the climate and air, we're talking about human rights, the rights to life, rights to health, rights to physical integrity, and they can be treated as the two sides of the same coin. Climate crisis, on the one hand, is a scandalous murderer. We went to the Office of the High Commissioner of United Nations for Human Rights, recognizing climate change as the main threat to human rights, with repercussions on health, such as health, food, water, culture, development. So it's a crisis that is threatening the survival of persons, and it does it very loudly.
While air, which is the other side of the coin, it is more silent. So we wonder if we can address these two problems at the same time, and the answer is yes. While we are getting worried urgently about the climate, we also have another problem that we have not placed so much attention on, which is atmospheric contamination, which is two things that are related to human rights, and two of the biggest challenges faced by humanity, both of them related to the atmosphere where we develop our lives. So how are they related? There's a very particular relationship here, which is through contaminant, which are short-lived climatic contaminants, which are supposed to be responsible for over 30% of global warming. And even more recently, they've said that they could even be responsible for up to 45% of global warming. So since they're closely linked with rights and also with a healthy environment, which was recently declared as a human right, the obligations of the states and of the business sector to respect human rights, those are also related to their obligations to control emissions, to address the climate crisis better and atmospheric contamination. So let's look at these new contaminants that we are referring to when we talk about air and climate. The short-lived climate contaminants, they're key to make progress in both sides of the coin that we're talking about. They have two main characteristics. First is that they in fact contaminate the atmosphere, affecting our health. The yields of crops, they're also important contributing factors of global warming. We said that up to 45% responsible probably, and once issued, they remain in the atmosphere for very little time. And this third characteristic make these short-lived contaminants be a very good opportunity to face the climate crisis. We know that some are direct, some are indirect, but we're going to focus on the four main ones, which is black carbon, methane, tropospheric ozone, and HFCs. It is important to take into account that CO2 has been the main greenhouse gas effect, and the one that we placed the most attention on, and a very important characteristic that differentiates it completely from short-lived climatic contaminants is that CO2 can remain centuries, even millennia in the atmosphere. So even if we were to stop all emission sources, we turned off all CO2 emitting sources, we would still see the production of the effects of climate warming from CO2 that would remain in the atmosphere. But since short-lived climate contaminants, air pollutants, remain for such little time in the atmosphere, the reduction of their emission would have an impact in the very, very short term. We're even talking about weeks, months, or a few years, which would favor the reduction of the speed of warming for the next decades, and it would help prevent abrupt climate changes as the ones that are being predicted by the different models, particularly those related to these dangerous tipping points as the ones we've heard of in previous presentations. So by shutting down sources of these four short-lived air pollutants, which are black carbon, methane, tropospheric ozone, and HFCs, we could see much quicker effects than if we shut down sources of CO2, which is what seems to be the most relevant one. At present, in Latin America, Africa, South East Asia, and the Pacific, the contributions of some of these contaminants, methane and black carbon, they're quite high, while carbon dioxide are low in comparison to other regions. So it gives us a net effect of warming after 10 years that's substantially higher than that of only CO2, or we're only placing attention on CO2. On the last report, IPCC was quite specific. They devoted a whole chapter to highlighting the relationship between air and climate through short-lived pollutants. So it was very specific about the importance of including strategies to reduce these pollutants. This IPCC assessment managed to identify the sectors and the key pollutants to manage in our region, for example, highlighting that mitigation policies should really be focused on particulated matter and ozone, especially in the industrial zone, energy production, and the burning of biomass, which is also very important for the emission of methane and some black carbon as well. So waste management from diesel engines, also management for fossil fuels in our region, make us contribute in a reduction of up to 90% of black carbon emissions in the countries that are not part of the OECD from now to 2100, which would be significant in reducing climate change and climate warming. Now, what we've done is to contribute this information as a great opportunity of action to cover these two sides of the coin, of the same problem that affects us. And we have made publications surrounding the short-lived air pollutants in Latin America. We also have a publication with the UN. We've made incidents. So countries in Latin America incorporate short-lived air pollutants in their NACs and in climate change laws. We've produced incidents to improve the quality of air in 4 cities of the region: Mexico, Bogota, Santiago, and Sao Paulo. And we've also devoted our time to disseminate information to key stakeholders in the region, you all, of course, about the relation between the quality of air in cities of Latin America, climate change, its impacts on health, and its impacts on other human rights. How? Well, through awareness raising campaigns, participating in events such as this one, and other ways. What are we left with? We're left with the need to act, of having and implementing and carrying out integrated solutions that already exist. Today, we already have available cost-effective and efficient measures to reduce the emissions of these pollutants. If these measures were implemented globally, then we'd be talking about global methane reductions of up to 40% and black carbon of the 80% by 2030, which would in turn help us to prevent an additional warming of 0.5 degrees centigrade by 2015. Measures to replace hydrofluorocarbonated with alternatives with lower climatic potential. Just this measure could contribute with a further 0.1 degree centigrade less increase. Some measures to control methane from the industry, in this trying to reduce the emissions in intensive cattle breeding. There's also proven measures to reduce or to take better advantage of the methane emissions in mining as well, exploitation of hydrocarbons as well. Great dams also emit methane, so perhaps looking for projects that are not as methane intensive for generation of electricity. We can capture methane with waste management. There's technologies to eliminate black carbon, which is somewhat costly, but they're available, which is basically to implement better filtering alternatives or different alternatives to burning fossil fuels, dirty fuels, so to speak, such as diesel. And so developed countries have already applied some of these measures and have managed to significantly reduce their emissions. That is why we see that right now, they really don't have too many problems associated to methane, ozone, and black carbon, but to other pollutants. So we need to modernize heating and cooking systems. This is one of the things, as I said earlier, family sourced contributions to pollution, that also contributes to climate warming, perhaps addressing transportation means that have lower emissions. In any event, we need cross-cutting policies that help us address these short-lived air pollutants. The policies, as we are seeing, they protect many other human rights as well. And among these rights, they protect rights to health because they reduce the mortality and morbidity rates associated to a poor air quality. They also reduce the amount of deaths that can be prevented that would otherwise come from the climate crisis. And also, if we look at it as a strategic development or in terms of the compliance of strategic compliance of agreements, it also impacts several of the SDGs. For example, sustainable cities, affordable clean energy, responsible production, and so on. Addressing these findings will mitigate not only the short-term warming, but also improve the quality of the air in the region with solutions that are already available, a problem that needs our immediate attention. And I'm very pleased to share this information today to have us all see two sides of the same coin in such an important event, something that demands action right away. So we need to turn the coin around and see that the quality of air is also there. It also has an impact on health. It also demands our attention right now. And with one single action, we can address both problems. So that is my presentation, and thank you very much for your
Muchísimas
attention.
gracias, ingeniera
Thank you
Daniela
very
García
much,
Aguirre.
Daniela García Aguirre.
Excelente presentación, información
Excellent
valiosa
presentation, very valuable
y de gran
information,
provecho para toda nuestra audiencia nacional e
very
internacional.
useful for
Especialmente
all of our
Panamá,
national and
les
international
queda muy
audience.
agradecidos
Panama
por esta
especially is
información.
very thankful for
Bueno,
this
seguidamente
information. Very well.
contamos con la
Next,
participación
we have
del doctor Chris Newman.
Dr. Chris
El
Newman.
doctor Chris Newman es un médico
Newman
de familia del Reino
is
Unido. Fue
head,
cofundador
family
de un
doctor
grupo de
from the
protesta de
UK.
profesionales de
He
la
was
salud
co-founder
en respuesta a las enormes protestas por el clima en
of a
Londres
health professional
en
protest group in
2019
response to his
por
huge
parte de un
climate
grupo llamado
protests in
Extinction
London
Rebellion
2019,
y
a
para
group called
dar
Extinction
la legitimidad
Rebellion.
de la
And in
profesión
order
médica
to
a este
provide
grupo,
legitimacy of the
se
medical profession to this
autodenominaron
group, they called
médicos
themselves
por Extinction
Doctors
Rebellion.
for
Han
Extinction
recibido el
Rebellion.
apoyo del director
They
de
have
The Lancet,
received the support of the
de
head
dos
of the
antiguos
Lancet,
directores del British Medical
of
Journal
two former heads of the British
y del
Medical
director de la
Journal,
Organización
and
Mundial
the
de la
head of the
Salud,
World Health
el doctor
Organization, Dr. Tedros
También es
Ghebreyesus.
director de
He's
Earth Medic,
also the
una
director
ONG
of
del clima
Earth
y
Medic,
salud con
a
sede en el
climate and
Caribe.
health NGO based
Bienvenido,
in the
doctor Chris
Caribbean.
Newman.
Welcome,
Queda con usted el
Dr.
micrófono.
Chris Newman. You have the floor. Thank you. I'm going to speak in English.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias
Very well.
al
Thank
Dr.
you
Chris
so
Newman.
much to Dr. Chris
Excelente
Newman.
ponencia.
Excellent
Agradecemos
presentation.
mucho la información y
We
el estímulo
greatly
que nos ha
thank him
dado.
for the information and
Bueno,
how stimulating this talk
hemos
has been.
tenido un
Very
panel
well.
de
We've had a
expertos
panel of
extremadamente
experts that's
importantes.
extremely
Seguidamente
important.
vamos a
And
escuchar
next, we will
al
hear
licenciado
from
Juan Pablo Olson.
Mr. Juan Pablo
El
Olson.
licenciado Olson es licenciado en
Mr.
Sociología
Juan Pablo, he is
de la
a
Facultad
graduate
de
in
Ciencias
sociology
Sociales de
from
la Universidad de
the
Buenos
Faculty of
Aires.
Social
Es
Science
magíster en
of Buenos
Gestión
Aires
del Recurso del
University.
Agua,
He
profesor
specifies in water
del
management,
tema Los desafíos de
professor
Argentina y América Latina ante el
in the
calentamiento
issue
global
of
y la crisis hídrica mundial.
the
Vamos a darle entonces
global
unas
crisis.
palabras,
So
unos
let's now
minutos al
allow him
licenciado
a
Olson
few
para
minutes,
que
Mr.
nos
Olson,
dé esta
for
información
him to
valiosa.
provide this valuable information.
Thank you, Dr. Carlos. Thank you to the Panamanian Society of Public Health and to the speakers with really brilliant presentations that clarify this diagnosis that we're facing. And just to add, from our perspective, I am part of a global movement that works on the climate and ecological crisis, and also with regards to its relations to what Dr. Amy Woodson Bolton mentioned, which is colonialism, the extraction of resources, and the consolidation of a system that comes from a genocide of American populations in the time that's called the conquest of America, and to emphasize that we're going from a genocide of American populations where we're looking, historians talk about around 10 million people, or nations originary from the Americas, and based on which was consolidated what has been mentioned very clearly and brilliantly, which is that the current planetary system leads us to the limit of human survival in terms of the warming of the planet's temperature, as well as air and water pollution, and it places us in a very borderline situation, which we need to add. And to add to this, the social context, which Dr. Valladares and Ms. Amy, Professor Woodson Bolton also mentioned, but it's just also the extreme situations of the poor countries and basically the global south, which don't have the financing available to adapt their energy matrices, but moreover are countries that are submitted to processes of foreign debt, with debts that many of them are financial schemes which come from the groups of power represented by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the G7. And what we are questioning is not only the climate crisis and the need to act based on what the scientists are mentioning, but also to denounce the debt that the countries of the global south are being submitted to, such that they will not have the resources for their adaptation, and submit them to a future catastrophic loss of human life. And so what I'm talking about is, for my campaign of doubt for climate, is a question within the scenario of global war, massive extinction and the scarcity of water, questioning the non-application of the fund of the Paris Agreement so that our developing countries can have the resources to move ahead with a just transition. And so it's within this context, we are making a call to a mobilization that really makes us look at those who are responsible for global warming, the oil industry, the large producers, and who have the possibility to really realize structural change. And the question is what to do when we're facing a model of the world where there's a group with the concentrated power of financial and economic and political power, which is the industry of negation, which is dedicated millions of dollars to reject this issue of climate change and how to make a call to a mobilization in the streets, which is what Dr. Chris Newman was talking about. Just time to move, to take action, to connect a global movement of international solidarity to really go deeper into this issue that scientists are denouncing, in which we specifically want to question not only the lack of action in terms of climate change as we head towards the summit in Egypt, but also to really question at the summit of the G7, to question the groups that are the decision makers. We are calling a global action, taking the information of the scientists to denounce the financial and illegitimate debts that are applied in the global south within the context of global warming, and to claim, look at this ecological debt that you have very brilliantly explained these northern countries have with the countries of the global south. Otherwise, there will be populations that will be destined to be sacrificed. We will be territories of sacrifice and disposable populations. So this is where we're making a call to a large action, global action, the representation of 25 countries, especially representing the countries of the global south that are precisely in the maps that you have shown, the populations that will most suffer the effects of global warming, from Latin America to Africa to the Southeastern Asia. So we make a call to the solidarity of all groups of scientists, climate groups, environmental groups, and syndicate movements to a mobilization with one voice. It's time to act. It's time to question the financial system that led us to this apocalyptic scenario. And so we are very grateful to the organization of events such as this one, where we are putting on the table the information in detail of what the scenarios will be that we will be facing if we do not generate a change. And so my participation was just a brief to let you know that there is a campaign for international networking called Debt for Climate, and that we are accompanying all of the interventions and mobilizations of scientists because they were the first to make a call for there to be a reaction from the ensemble of the planetary community. So thank you for your commitment, for the information, for your courage, for your mobilization, and for your solidarity. And I believe that the rest of our climate organizations, environmental organizations, social movements, and syndicate spaces must take this information to generate a global critical mass that can react and lead to a structural change. So simply just to thank you for your brilliant presentations, and we are entirely available to serve for anything that can lead to mobilization and action that can lead to international, interdisciplinary, and intergenerational solidarity. If we do not react now, the ones that will suffer the consequences are our children and not even our grandchildren, because in the next 8, 10, 20 years, as the doctors were mentioning, we will be seeing that if there is not a change, as you mentioned now, it's a reaction that needs to be taken before it's too late. Thank you so much, and I send you all a warm hug of congratulations and solidarity and of commitment to the battle that we are all moving
Gracias
forward
a usted,
together.
licenciado Juan Pablo Olson. Palabras contundentes, motivadoras.
Really strong and motivating words.
Ya ahora o nunca, realmente.
So it's now or never, really.
Bueno, con
We
esto
are
hemos
all
terminado
in agreement
la
on
etapa de
this. So with
ponencias.
this, we have
Pido unos
concluded
minutos adicionales.
the
Tenemos varias preguntas,
phase of
pero nos
presentations,
falta
and I just
tiempo.
ask you for a few more minutes. We have several questions, but we don't have so much time, and so
las conclusiones que también vamos a tocar.
we'll also be looking at the
Tenemos
conclusions.
un comentario
So we have a
de Eduardo
comment
Reyes.
from Mr. Eduardo Reyes, who
Metas
says,
no sencillas, no imposibles,
not
largo plazo,
simple
educación,
goals,
corto plazo, aglutinar
long-term
ciudadanos
education,
preocupados
and in the
en una
short
sola
term,
organización de vocería
bringing
y
together
lucha contra esta crisis
citizens that are
climática. Debemos
concerned
poner también atención a
to
los
fight
disruptores
against this
endocrinos.
climate
Son algunas de los comentarios.
crisis, and we must
Tenemos
pay
muchas
attention also
preguntas,
to
pero vamos a
endocrine
tratar,
disruptors,
por
some of the
tema de
comments.
tiempo,
So we have
tal vez en
many
sintetizarla
questions
en una o dos preguntas.
and synthesize in one or two questions.
Para el profesor Valladares, probablemente
For
una forma de
Professor
hipocresía
Valladares,
organizada
a
sería,
form of organized
sería que somos
hypocrisy would
accionistas en
be
bien del
that
ambiente,
we are
pero somos
stakeholders
consumidores de
for the
productos
environment, but
cárnicos,
that we
lo
are
que aumenta la producción
consumers
del
of meat products,
extensionismo
which
pecuario,
increases the
hidrobiológico, etcétera, generando más CO2 y
pollution
metano,
and issues
que a su vez aumentan el
generated
efecto
by
invernadero y la
agricultural
desaparición de la
practices
biodiversidad
and animal
de los
husbandry
ecosistemas
practices,
acuáticos
which have an
por
impact
pesca
on
de
the
mar de
reduction of
fondo.
biodiversity
Si tiene algún
at
comentario
all
de
levels.
pocos minutos, le agradezco,
If you have a
profesor
comment to
Valladares.
this, thank you so much, Professor Valladares. Yes, of course. Thank you for this question. Yes, undoubtedly, nobody escapes this element of this organized hypocrisy, and we all fall in a certain degree of contradiction, but perhaps what we need to do is review the gravity of our contradictions. Undoubtedly, if we eat meat once a month, we're not having the same footprint as a large oil producer who pretends to have a green image and signing agreements that lead to tremendous greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, there's the hypocrisy or the recognition of this hypocrisy, which has to be social in some cases, but sometimes it needs to go beyond that to the civil or to the tax levels or to whatever legal levels that are required. It must come from an exercise of self-criticism. And in a period of transition like the one that we're in, and actually an urgent transition, probably we will all be affected by a contradiction. So we must be lenient with certain small contradictions, but we cannot be lenient with the large contradictions and the large conceptual mistakes at a time when we have to reduce emissions and we carry out activities that are not along that line. And so undoubtedly the reduction of meat consumption and to change our highly caloric diets that characterize certain countries, especially in Europe and Northern America, these are undoubtedly very important pieces, but there is more, and we must make the full list.
Listo, muchas gracias, profesor Valladares.
Thank you,
Bien,
Professor Valladares.
una pregunta de
A question
Yariela
from
Herb o
Yariela
Vera
Herb
Martínez.
or
No tengo
Overa
claro.
Martinez,
Excelentes
I'm not
ponencias. La
sure.
pregunta es qué se
Excellent
puede gestionar
presentations. The
en
question is,
corto
what
plazo a
can we
nivel
do
del sector
here in the
industrial
short term in terms of the industrial
de las
sector?
empresas que son las que más influyen en
The
estos efectos
companies
tan
that have the
dramáticos
greatest
del cambio
impact on these
climático? Ya pues
dramatic
el licenciado Juan Pablo Olson
influence on
ha
climate
dado
change.
bastante
So
información
Juan Pablo
sobre
Olson has
esta
provided a
pregunta.
lot of information about this
Para
question.
terminar, entonces,
So just
paso
to
la
close,
palabra
I will pass the
al doctor
floor
Eddie Cabrera, de la
to
Sociedad
Dr.
Panameña de
Eddie
Salud
Cabrera
Pública,
from the
cual
Panamanian
va a hacer un
Society of
compendio muy
Public Health,
breve de las
who will
conclusiones
provide
de
a
este
brief
importante
summary
evento.
of the
Eddie, con usted el
conclusions
micrófono.
of this important event. Eddie, you have the floor. Good day to all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the conference. Thank you for taking action. The conclusions, truly, I think Dr. Olson already made them, but I'm just going to highlight a couple things. The issue of climate change is terrifying, as was said. 1.5 degrees Celsius on average in the world does not seem to be that much, but it is actually finishing with all of us as a society. So most of the oceans absorb the heat. So it is difficult for us to realize in the general population that this change is happening. When CO2 increases and the heat waves increase and humidity increases, all of this is leading us to a vicious cycle that will destroy us. 10% of the population that has the power is the one that is abusing and all of this and basically is killing us. So we must have food security and food sovereignty to be able to face this. Dr. Valladares very accurately said that to understand the magnitude of the problem, 600,000 atomic bombs is the energy that has been spilt over the span of 50 years. And this is what is generating the problem. So if now we're complaining about migration, in this decade, there will be 216 million people migrating. There are tipping points that are very clear. Permafrost, perhaps in Panama, we don't realize this, but in South America, when we would wake up in the morning in Quito, in Bogota, we would see the whole mountain range covered in ice the whole year, all year round. Now we don't see this. Like this, there are other problems. Water, 1 out of 3 people has serious problems with regards to access to water. So what are we doing for this? And Dr. Valladares also said the banks are blocking all of the projects to improve our environment. And Dr. Bolton gave us very clear image that there is a war for racial and economic superiority. Technology wars are leading to a depopulation. There's issues around litter, garbage. We must continuously measure the quality of the air that is the short life environmental pollutants can be addressed quickly. However, there must be environmental policies. And the conclusion is that we must rebel. We must carry out studies for mining, water, pollution, air. We must seek out the truth because we are being continuously lied to. We must develop the agriculture, and especially what Dr. Newman said, we must act. We must act. We cannot be sitting down, drinking a cup of tea. We must take action. And once again, Dr. Olson said how we can do it. Debt for climate, in exchange for climate. Thank you so much. And I hope that this will be a reason for us to continue gathering and that we can become groups of action, not just to talk and make beautiful poetry. We must take action.
Muchas gracias, doctor
Thank
Eddie
you
Cabrera.
so much. Thank you, Dr. Eddie
Seguidamente,
Cabrera.
un minuto para el doctor
So
Claude Betts,
one more minute for
expresidente de
Dr.
la Sociedad
Claude
Panameña de
Betts,
Salud
former
Pública.
president of the Panamanian Society
Dr.
of
Betts.
Public Health. Dr. Betts. Well, thank you so much. The truth is that this has been something that I hope can be shared everywhere, not just in Panama, but also in all of Latin America, because of the excellent presentations that give us a very integral vision, and especially of how we can tell stories where these stories touch not only our mind, but that we really must reach the hearts of people so that we can go from an intellectual response to a response of communal action and finally achieve the social energy that is sufficient to mobilize forces that up until now have not been in motion because they have not felt the sufficient social pressure. I think the work that the panelists have made very clear is the need to transform information into concrete actions, and especially into community actions where the entire population is involved, because it is really something that is not just about a group of scientists, but it's a problem that affects all of us, and especially our children and grandchildren who are still small and who will suffer the consequences either of our actions or of our lack of actions. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Claude Betts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Claude Betts. And so with this, we conclude this conference. Thank you. So thank you
Peter Kalmas,
so much, Dr. Peter
al doctor
Kalmas,
Fernando Valladares, a la
Dr.
profesora
Fernando
Annie
Valladares,
Woodson,
Professor Annie
a la
Woodson
ingeniera
Bolton,
Daniela García Aguirre,
Engineer
al doctor
Daniela
Chris Newman
García Aguirre,
y al
Dr.
licenciado
Chris
Juan Pablo
Newman,
Olson.
and Mr.
Todos
Juan
ellos
Pablo
nos han dejado una información
They have
valiosísima
all left us with
y ahora
very
nos toca
valuable
actuar. Así
information,
que,
and now it's time
ya
to
saben,
take action.
ahora o nunca.
So now you
La
know,
Sociedad
it's
Panameña de
now or
Salud Pública
never.
y el
The
colectivo
Panamanian
Ya es Ya
Association of public
con
health and the organization. Ya is ya, which means now is
como líder,
now.
Renata Spooner,
The leader of whom is
hemos estado
Renata
preparando
Spooner.
este
We have
primer
been preparing this
seminario
first
y
seminar,
nos abocamos ahora a continuar este trabajo de
and we will
divulgación
now
y de
continue
estímulo
our
a toda la
efforts in
ciudadanía. La Sociedad
sharing
Panameña de
this
Salud Pública tiene
information
una
to the
conferencia de prensa
entire
el día de hoy a
citizenship.
la 1
And
de
so
la
we have a
tarde
press conference
con los
today
medios
at
de
1
comunicación
p.m.
y
with
seguimos
the
trabajando. A todos los
media,
participantes y
and we
asistentes,
continue working. To all the
gracias por su
participants,
presencia. Esperamos que se
thank you
unan
for
a esta
your
lucha
presence, and we
y que
hope you
estimulen
will
a todos los
join
demás a
this
participar.
battle and
Chao,
that you
hasta
will
luego.
stimulate others to participate.
Saludos a
Goodbye.
todos.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you so much. It's been fantastic. Thank you.